Hello and welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Tom Brown, author of a fascinating new book, The Mind of the Minister. CSW's audience will know why we wanted to speak to Tom when they hear the book's subtitle, which is Restoring Trust Between Ministers and Civil Servants. Now then, Tom, during the course of your career, you have worked with thousands of civil servants, public officials, and politicians, maybe hundreds of politicians rather than thousands of politicians, but you are not a civil servant or a politician. So how come you have had such high levels of exposure? I make them sound like a disease or something, but yeah, how come you've met so many?
Well, thanks very much for having me on the podcast, Jess. And I'll declare early that we are actually colleagues. So within our family of companies, the Civil Service World as a sister company or organisation and brand to the one that I work for, which is Dodds Training, and our wider training business across Total Politics. And that's basically the reason that I have met and worked with so many civil servants, both in the UK and around the world.
So you are training them to do what?
Yes. Well, most of our training is in better policy making and better communication skills as sort of fundamental blocks of a functioning government. I think sort of from the baseline, we believe that government exists to serve citizens, does that through projects and services that are underpinned by policy. And so if you can improve policy making, you can improve the policy process, then ultimately you get better outcomes for citizens. And that's kind of our driver, really.
Great. So that's the day job. Tell me, what possessed you to write a book?
Well, I think I've sat in a spot which is probably somewhere between Westminster and Whitehall on many occasions, metaphorically, not Parliament Square. And I think that observation of that is that there was a pretty clear deterioration of relations between ministers and senior civil servants, which I think had probably been taking place over a slightly longer period of time. But for me, at least, came to a head in 2020 when we had more permanent secretaries forcibly removed from post than at any point in our history.
Yeah.
And certainly the period 2016 to 2024 was chaotic, both self-inflicted from a decision to proceed with Brexit and then through COVID as well, where there was a lot of crisis and
Perma-crisis.
Perma-crisis, yeah. But I think in that time, through difficult times, the relationships were strained too.
Yeah.
And I suppose my observation was that I couldn't find anything out there where someone had explored this relationship.
And the breakdown.
And the breakdown of the relationship.
Yeah.
And as I talked to people, I discovered that at the senior levels of both ministers and permanent secretaries, people were itching to talk about this and knowing that this was an area that really needs to be explored.
I know you did a lot of reading and research, but how many interviewees on both sides, on political and official, did you get?
Well, on the record, I started with 6 and 6, and then actually ended up being 7 permanent secretaries and 6 former ministers. But there were many, many more off the record, particularly from special advisors, to try and give a bit more insight and sort of round things off a bit and to really understand what's going on. But most of this book is about people and how people work together. And the reality is that people are different from each other. People have different preferences. People have different strengths and styles. And so much of building and working in highly charged professional environments with people that are trying to do difficult jobs, it can be complicated to build good and trusting relationships.
Yeah.
And it's not formulaic.
I know you haven't got a silver bullet for how we can, and as you say, everybody's different, but, about building trust and building that relationship. But I just wanted to ask you why you chose the title of the book. And also I wanted to have a guess. So obviously I'll just remind listeners of the title of the book. It's The Mind of the Minister. Is that hinting at the fundamental imbalance in that relationship? There's a very interesting passage in the book where former PermSec Claire Moriarty points out that the emotional labour of building relationships very much sits on the civil service side. And the very idea of an official shouting at a minister is simply inconceivable because the relationship is not such that would ever happen. And so tell me why you chose to give more weight to the mind of the minister rather than if it's about the relationship on both sides?
So I wrote the entire book before I had the title. It was the last thing that I managed to do. The final two actions I took were finally landing on a title and writing the acknowledgements. My wife can claim much credit for the eventual title because my previous working versions were terrible. And I don't think we would have sold many books, if I'm honest.
Can I hear one of them?
Oh, no, I don't. It's quite embarrassing. I mean, at a low point, Trust Minister was one of the working titles, which I don't think was going to work very well.
Trust Minister.
No, I had some bad options before Mind of the Minister. I think one of the reasons to land there was that having spoken to an awful lot of people and really, I feel, gained some kind of what feels like a more objective insight from sitting neither as a minister or a civil servant and trying to just hear from both sides about the nature of the relationship. For me, it does start with the minister. Civil servants know what they are supposed to do when a minister arrives. That is a sort of extremely well-trodden and practiced procedure and ritual of when a minister arrives, because so many ministers have arrived in the last 10 years in every department.
Yeah.
But they're still learning really about the minister more than the minister is learning about the civil servants, because the minister can come and go at any point. They're the ones with the mandate. So for me, the foundation of a good relationship is a minister taking the right first steps towards the civil servants, and to, I suppose, kind of be prepared, perhaps in their mind, about how they want to work. Because so many of the decisions which influence the quality of the relationship are decisions which are made by the minister.
Yeah.
And the things which improve the relationship, they also tend to be activities and actions and decisions made by the minister as well. If a minister is more clear about understanding who they are, how they like to work, what they want to do, what they want to prioritize, all those things provide a much stronger foundation for civil servants to, one, be able to work with them really well. Those types of things, they really help with establishing a good working relationship at the beginning and helping to build trust between both sides.
This is a fundamental question, but why is the relationship between ministers and senior civil servants so critical? I think Una O'Brien, former permanent secretary at the Department of Health, said that on a scale of 1 to 10, she would put that relationship at about 15.
Yeah.
It's like that's how important it is. But can you just give us a sense for listeners who might be, in operational roles far from the ivory towers of Whitehall? Why is that so important?
Before I answer the question, I will say from a biased perspective, as someone who's written an entire book about this and works in this kind of world, for me, it's the most important relationship in Britain.
Okay.
I wrote this book with a reflection of what's been happening in the UK, but I've done lots of work around the world, lots of work with other governments, and have lots of contact, particularly in other Commonwealth countries. I had so many messages from my contacts that work in other governments to say, we have exactly the same problem too. I read this book and it was like I was reading about Nigeria. I can't believe this. This is exactly the same in Barbados. This is exactly the same. And so this is not actually just a UK issue, despite, I think, for me at least, the issues and the problems being massively highlighted by quite an extreme period in history in terms of sort of uncertainty and change and crisis. Permacrisis. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't think this is a UK specific issue. This is the case in lots of different government contexts. The grand answer to this is that in a democracy, politicians, they're elected based on a mandate. So they're elected for a reason. They put out a manifesto or a set of ideas and they said, this is what we will do when we're in government, vote for us. People vote for them. The party with the most MPs forms a government. Ministers are selected by the Prime Minister. A cabinet is formed. That's a sort of, we don't have a constitution, but that's the basis of how we operate. The civil service is the delivery mechanism for government. Ministers can't they can't make anything happen without civil servants, really. Very little. Democratically, the relationship being unhealthy is a threat to our structure and system. It's a threat to democracy. It sounds very grand, but I think it probably is more that than it is not that. That's why I think it's the most important relationship in Britain, because when it's working very well, a government that people have elected can actually deliver their mandate. But when it's not working, they're hindered.
Kind of
they're hindered in doing that.
Yeah.
And they're unable to. That's my big answer.
Just a couple of tips, I suppose, for how ministers and civil servants can build a close and harmonious working relationship in which each has the trust of the other also sounds quite grand. But what are building trust for dummies sort of top tips?
I started with this sort of trust triangle basis of authenticity, logic, and empathy. So really that's about being open and honest with each other and being able to be candid in your conversation, being authentic. And I think ministers that have complaints, one of them can be that they don't feel like civil servants are being authentic. That's not a common issue that I've heard. I've heard that from only one or two former ministers, but I have heard it from one or two former ministers. The logic side is really understanding each other and where you come from. I mean, we have a sort of singular understanding of what is logical based on a set of rules of logic, but I think there's different types of logic. There can be political logic, where something is logical from a political perspective. That might not align with something which is economically logical.
Or evidence-based.
Or evidence-based, yeah. Evidence-based, or even in line with the logic of the department, because each department has a set of particular focuses.
Yeah.
The Department for Transport doesn't tend to get that involved in culture, media and sport, for example. There can be a departmental logic to the options that are put forward, for example, that don't necessarily align with the political logic of the minister. You know, and I think there can be misunderstandings of how each side is thinking and seeing things and the lens through which. So it's about sort of understanding the process of thinking and how their mind is working. In this case, I think understanding the mind of the minister is probably the variable, because ministers can change and they'd be quite different.
Yep.
The empathy side is linked to that, actually. I think often we don't draw a straight line between those two things, but the empathy side is understanding more about that person's situation and where they're coming from. And I think for civil servants, that's understanding the pressures and the different hats that ministers wear, which can be overlooked because it's not the responsibility of the department to be involved in constituency issues. But if you've got something going on as a minister in your constituency, that can take precedent in your thought processes.
Yeah.
And equally, a minister even appreciating some of the difficulties and challenges that civil servants face in trying to actually implement their idea, which might not be implementable. You know, so I think that's sort of understanding on both sides.
I wanted to just return to the idea of openness and candour on the civil service side. And you said that some ministers feel that their senior officials aren't being kind of authentic.
Yeah.
But obviously, you know, they have a duty to ensure that ministers aren't about to step into an elephant trap if they launch a policy, and to be as candid as possible. But how do you avoid, as a senior civil servant, accusations of being a naysayer or a blocker or kind of anti-innovation, or being happy to sit in a tepid bath of managed decline?
Yeah.
Because, you know, that's that balance that they have to strike, isn't it? And you got the feeling at some points in the last few years that ministers didn't want to hear no, or that they would automatically just assume the position that their civil servants were blocking innovation. How do they balance that?
I think if you had any minister come on here and you ask them, do you want civil servants to tell you the truth? They would all say yes. The problem is that most people think, I always want to hear the truth. I always want everyone to be honest with me. And I had the conversation with Simon MacDonald, who was the Foreign Office. And he said, yeah, of course, everyone says that. Everyone says that they want to hear the truth all the time. And I think the complicated thing is that ministers don't always want to hear what they don't want to hear. And so there is a complicated reality here, which is that there is some management to be done. Ultimately, I think ministers do really want to know what everything that's going on. They are being honest when they say that. They do want to, even if they will react badly. And it's still better to push forward and through with the candour and get a bad reaction from the minister, because ultimately everyone will be better equipped to deal with things. I think, you know, maybe some civil servants can misread a bad reaction from a minister as meaning you've done something wrong. And it doesn't. Ministers are under extreme pressure. They're sleep deprived. They're generally under-equipped.
Yeah.
Then they're not in sort of prime performance state.
Yeah.
So they are going to react badly to news that they don't want to hear. But it's enormously worse for them to be blindsided further down the line with something that they didn't know about, that they should have known about, and then they have to react and respond to that. So like, this is not easy, all this stuff. And there's humans involved. So you're going to have some bad reactions along the way.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you a question about the here and now, because I've heard you say ministers and officials should try and maintain the relationship all year round, a bit like a garden. You know, you can't just put work in one season. You've got to work on that trust in the relationship when times are good, not just sort of try and start doing it when you reach a crisis. Are we in a good period now, would you say? I mean, we're about a year into this new government. Is this when they have to put in the hard work? And also sort of part two of that question, since writing the book, what have you observed about relations between ministers and top officials in this newish government of ours?
So we're not in a crisis in the same way that we have been during Brexit and COVID. I don't know if there ever is like a sort of rosy time, is there? You know, we can look. I think it's more often that we look back on a period and we say, "Oh, that was better.
Yeah,
that was a calmer time."
Yeah,
and it probably never feels it in practice. I really think that it depends on the department and the people. So we don't have some existential major crisis going on at the moment. We're not actually in a major crisis right now. So by that definition, this is a better time than we have had. And we are in normal policy-making world now, which we've had a break from for pretty much 8 years.
Yes.
You know, we didn't have normal operating. There was not much policy going on for a really long time.
Yeah. And during Brexit, not much delivery either.
No, not much delivery either. That's right. Yeah. There was a singular focus for Brexit.
Yeah.
And even COVID was just a reactionary singular focus, keep everything going, you know. So we are in a time now, but this was coming. So it's not like it's caught us unawares. Like, we knew 15, 16 months ago, you know, we had a good idea that there'd be a new government coming through that would be in a period where they would be implementing day-to-day policy. They would take ideas through to all the way through to delivery at some stage during, you know. So we knew that was coming. But each department's different. If you get rumor that your department might be abolished, then it's not a calm time, is it?
No,
you know?
no.
Or suddenly someone decides that I feel for the people at Home Office, because it's never a good day. It's never good news for the Home Office. So it's either like quiet is good news or like noisy is bad news, you know? So it depends where you are, but also it depends on the minister as well and what their own experience is. You know, the late David Amos, who, rest in peace, David, because it's an awful tragedy. The first time I met him in Parliament, I was asking whether he would be involved in delivering some of our Parliament work sessions. And he said, yes, come and meet with me in my office. So I went into his office and I was invited in by his office manager, who said, yeah, sit down. And I thought, this chair's a bit close. This is a strange setup. I thought it was okay. And he came and sat down and he shoved his chair forward and our knees were almost touching. And he said, so where are you from?
Dodds Training.
I'm from Dodds Training, yeah. I just wanted to talk about how Parliament works and having groups. Yeah, okay, right. So, yeah, but where are you really from?
Wow.
And I said, I don't know what's going on here. He was really hostile towards me and asking me all these really difficult questions. And I thought, this is not what I thought meeting was going to be at all.
Yeah.
And then suddenly I thought, oh, cake. I'd forgotten about cake. And he had been stung by brass eye many years before.
Gosh, I remember. Was that him?
That was
that episode?
Yeah. Years, and this is 15 years earlier or something, where he'd been convinced that cake was a new type of drug, and I was embarrassed by it, and saying it in Parliament.
Oh
and all
gosh,
this
no
stuff.
wonder he was wary.
And so I just said, oh, it's not cake. I'm sorry, it's not cake. And then we managed to find a way through, ended up doing loads of work together. And I said, no, we've worked with all these other people, you can ask about us. But the reason I say that...
I'm not a satirist.
No, exactly, yeah, I'm not here to stink, it's not a trap. But the reason I say that story is that you don't always know what kind of trigger there might be for a minister that they're still carrying.
Yeah.
And so the point is that at any moment, something can arise and that you're not expecting, that feels like suddenly a very difficult time because of a personality. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is about building the relationship in the good times and improving things in the good times. But also, difficult things happen in government generally without notice.
Yeah.
You know, anything can just pop up at any point. So, you know, you do have to be fleet-footed about it. And senior civil servants are very good at that. But it's taking the moments, really, I think, to keep kind of building trust. Respect is probably like the word I heard most from ministers about how they would feel and demonstrate trust in civil servants. So mutual respect and competence. Those two things can do more to build trust than probably anything else. When a time feels like a good time, that is the time to sort of build respect and demonstrate competence. And the more ministers feel like they can trust that civil servants will do a good job and that they will be respected and feel respected, which is a big thing. How a minister feels is actually really important. More so, I think, than we give credit for.
That's great. I've just got 2 very quick questions. The first is about how the relationship changes over the lifespan of a minister, assuming they are there for more than 11 months or something. Could you share some, but not all, because we don't want to spoil the book for anyone who's going to go out and buy it. I know you spoke to Vince Cable about this specific topic, about, how he worked on his relationship or how he experienced the relationship with civil servants when he'd just come in versus towards the end of his tenure. Was it as business secretary? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, Vince Cable, he uncommonly did an entire parliamentary term. He did all 5 years as the Secretary of State for Biz, as it was then. I think that, ministers come in amongst enormous uncertainty. There's this story about Harriet Harman, who was waiting for a call. This is back in the day when when it's a phone call you're going to get on your landline in 97. And she's waiting for a call from Tony Blair at home, waiting for ages by the phone. And I think she had to sort of go to the loo or something and just said to her daughter, stay by the phone. I'm expecting an important call. And so she came back and she said, has anyone called? She said, yes, but don't worry. I hung up. It was number 10 down the street. And I said, you're waiting for a call from the Prime Minister. She's lucky because they called her back.
Yes.
But you don't know as a minister. You get very little notice, usually, if you're coming into a new post. So that's the context with which you arrive. Vince Cable, he potentially thought he was going to be Chancellor.
Right, yeah.
The whole deal was done without him. He wasn't involved in the negotiations, ended up being business secretary. So you're coming in this, and this is the sort of classic thing, is that you come in with knowing nothing but full of energy, and you leave knowing everything and with nothing left.
Is that Tony Benn?
Yeah, so that's Tony Benn. And I've heard many iterations of that, of people claiming to be their own genius. But Vince Cable, I asked him, how did you change? He said, I got thicker skin.
Yeah.
I think he changed in lots of other ways that he maybe wouldn't sort of self.
Well, he was a former civil servant, wasn't he? Back in the day.
Yeah, many years before, I think. Yeah, many, many years before. He made mistakes along the way, like every minister does. And I think ministers do settle into themselves. And the way I structured the book was with a sort of beginning, middle and end of a ministerial life cycle in mind. So there's no defined period, just no time frames on these parts of a ministerial life. But, the beginning is optimism and drive and energy and excitement and all those things coming in. The middle is really the slog and the grind of government and the reality of compromise and finding that you can't do everything that you want to do. And the end can be quite sort of sudden and brutal.
Brutal, yeah.
But it doesn't have to be brutal. Ministers, their star is rising or falling. There's no flat line.
Yeah.
One of the ways out is promotion.
Yeah.
And another way out is demotion or otherwise. It's such a sort of uncertain position to be in.
And civil servants have to be conscious of kind of where the minister is in the cycle.
Exactly.
And their own concerns about their legacy, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. What has been told to me is the best advice for ministers is to have 1 or 2 ideas, which I think Michael Gove is the proponent of this idea, that to have 1 or 2 ideas that's the maximum you'll achieve as a minister. That's as much as you can make happen. Be focused. But they do come and go, and it is important to recognise where they are in the lifespan and also where they are thinking ahead too. So like you said, legacy. Ministers that manage to work well with civil servants do have things to talk about afterwards.
Yes.
And ministers that do not tend to have many things to talk about.
Yes. No, you're right. And someone like Gove, actually, every civil servant I've spoken to who's worked for him has been so energised by him and by his drive and his sense of direction. Yeah, I think often from the outside, that's been a bit of a surprise to just the general public that civil servants loved working for Gove. But, those reformers who bring their officials with them and have a sense of direction, And as you say, they prioritise on the few things that they want to achieve. So I've got one more question for you, which is about the process of writing the book. Who was the most difficult interviewee to pin down?
Rory Stewart was the most difficult, comfortably.
Because he's so famous now.
Yeah, well, it didn't help. I finally managed to speak to him, just fluke really, but I was on the sort of arrivals airport in Budapest, I think, and he was, and he picked up, and he was about to go on the stage in Western Canada to do a lecture.
Of course.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And we kept missing each other. We kept being in the wrong time zones and missing each other, and it couldn't work. And then Rishi Sunak called the election, and then suddenly there was one time when I was supposed to talk to Rory, and I saw him on TV live. I thought, oh, well, we're not doing this interview now, then, are we? You know, it was like that for ages, and then we finally made something work. And
was it worth the wait?
It was worth the wait, and he sort of naturally, he was walking the entire time. You know, we did it virtually.
He was a diplomat, wasn't he? So he was a civil servant.
Yeah.
And then was he a DFID minister?
Yes. So he was a DFID minister, he was a Foreign Office minister, and then he was DFID Secretary of State.
Right. Yes, of course.
And he was a minister in MOJ with David Gauke as well, and in DEFRA. He actually connected more of my interviewees than anyone else, which I didn't realise till later on, because he'd worked with Claire Moriarty at DEFRA, he'd worked with David Gauke at MOJ, you know, he had lots of connect points.
He's the Kevin Bacon of Whitehall.
The 7 degrees of Rory Stewart, yeah, I think. Actually, yeah, he ended up with a lot of touch points. And he's candid, he's full of pithy and well-crafted stories. He's had this one about Yemen, which was, he knew there were no staff on the ground in Yemen, but it had £100 million budget. And no sort of British staff on the ground. And he said, I want to talk to someone in Yemen, so I just have some understanding of how we're spending this money. Whoever the junior official who was talking to said, yes, of course, yeah, we have Zoom calls. And he said, oh, can I join one of these Zoom calls, or at least see a recording of one of these Zoom calls? Yeah. Of course, Minister, of course. Several weeks later, nothing. Please, can I just see some evidence of these Zoom calls? Yes, we're having trouble kind of downloading the file or something, you know.
Gosh.
Back and forth, and to the point of which eventually he was moved, and he never saw them. Okay. They were never produced, you know.
That does sound quite Yes Minister-esque, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, his description is, Sir Humphrey Appleby is effectively in his description of this this anecdote. I'm sure there's two sides to the story.
Of course, yes.
But you know, Rory's kind of full of those. And I think something I feel like I learned from my conversations with him is the degree to which how a minister feels is very important. Yeah. Because if a minister feels like civil servants are not on side, or feels like they're a lack of respect, or feels a lack of understanding for what they're trying to achieve, that puts a strain on the relationship. And it does matter how the minister feels. And that's a hard thing to quantify. And I think that's a hard thing in civil service land, because everyone is trying to operate with evidence, with a logical viewpoint, and thinking long term, and thinking about complexity. And its best and easiest way to do all of those things is with things which are solid and not changeable, and that you can provide an audit trail for, and that you can demonstrate is that, you know, evidence shows us that we should be doing this, this, or this. Let's make a decision, rather than slightly unpredictable feelings of this one person who's kind of in charge. That is really unhelpful in this way that we're trying to do everything. The truth is, it does matter how a minister feels, and so, as maybe unpopular as that would be for me to say, that does need to play a factor in the way that civil servants are thinking about building the relationship with them.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. And for those who want even more of Tom's insights in his excellent book, it's The Mind of the Minister, available from all good bookshops. And also, I should just say that it recently reached number 6 on the Times bestseller list. So we've got a bit of a celebrity on our hands here in the company. But thank you so much for joining us, Tom. And I hope you will come back and speak to the Civil Service World podcast again one day.
Anytime.